Morning, morning, morning. How are y'all doing today? Roads better this week? Yes, I did not almost die 3 times on the way here, which I'm very grateful for. Last week was not necessarily the same thing. Okay, welcome back. If you have not been here yet, just a quick introduction. My name is Bill Orton, and I'm one of the elders here. I am not a biblical scholar in the least bit. I am a layman, but I do have a passion for the Bible. And I definitely, just quick story, and I love introductions. Unfortunately, it's a weakness of mine when I talk or write. I like to concentrate on the introduction a lot. So if you notice, I've basically given the same introduction 5 times. So anyways, I was scared of the Bible, though, as a church member for a long time, and I didn't read it. And it was one of those things that bothered me quite a bit, because I sort of felt that disjointedness of like, I'm a committed Christian, and yet I don't know the Bible whatsoever. And the older I got, I felt like the more awkward it became, and in some ways, the harder it got to actually delve into the Bible. Thankfully, I did find some resources online that have been such wonderful help, these wonderful tools for me to discover what's actually in the Bible. To realize that the Bible, yes, is scary, it's big, it's complicated. It's a book that was written thousands and thousands of years ago to a very different culture to our own. But what's amazing is people are always people, sinners are always sinners, and there's a lot of profound truths that can be found, most importantly, obviously, Jesus Christ, but also just when you read the Old Testament in general, you can see yourself and your sinful nature and the patterns that happen when you that happened in your life. I was even just thinking one this morning, but I'm not going to share that with you. It wasn't necessarily a happy thought about myself. But so that's that. We are trying to cover the entire Old Testament, and if you've been with us, you realize that we're not actually going to accomplish that. But I'm trying to actually get through the entire biblical arc. So we're not going to get to each individual book of the Bible here, but we are going to talk about the entire arc. Because for whatever reason, as a church member, I didn't actually know that until maybe even 5 years ago. I didn't have a full grasp of the narrative sweep of like from creation to fall and to wandering around the desert and all that stuff and how they eventually end up in exile. So today, we're going to try to accomplish a lot. Again, we're not going to get to everything, but we're going to have the full biblical arc in our mind. We're going to talk about the exile, then we're going to talk about return to the promised land, and then we're going to talk about future hope. So future hope here is we are talking about Christmas right now to a certain degree. We are talking about the Old Testament's connection to the New Testament, and it's very appropriate right now because we are about to be in Christmas, and oftentimes though there's biblical prophecies that are talked about in the book of Isaiah, and we are going to talk about the book of Isaiah here. So I've said this maybe 5 times already. We are going to be covering many stories that might be familiar with you, but we're also going to be covering some stories that you might not be as familiar with. Don't necessarily worry about the particulars right now. I don't want you might get lost. As I've said, we're going to be taking a helicopter ride over the entire Old Testament, which means that you're not necessarily going to be able to see individual stories. We're gonna get lost. We're gonna lose the trees for the forest here, is what I'm saying. So here's another thing. We talked about the individual Bible stories being like a connect the dots. Like we know all these Bible stories. We know Adam and Eve. We know King David. We know Bathsheba. We know Samson. We know all that. But like sometimes like they're just these disconnected dots. These disconnected stories. And I've changed it up. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what this connected dot actually is? Rudolph? Well, I mean, it's seasonally appropriate, right? Yeah, I mean, might as well. No, let's not beat around the bush here. Hey, look. As I was going, I was like, I'm not sure that this is actually going to be that clear. Can you guys tell what it is actually? Yeah, that's the stocking scene, and I didn't even notice this. That's a nice little fire crackling down there. So sometimes we have these individual stories in our mind, but they're not necessarily connected. You don't actually see the full arc. You don't see how they're connected. And so when we're talking about these connections, we're talking about sometimes cross-references that are essentially, as you can see, I pointed this out last week, why is the book of Job being mentioned here, like at the very beginning of the Bible? There is a connection, like the authors of the book of Job are connecting to basically the first words, the first page of the Bible. And there's all these connections that exist. So the cross-reference is in the Bible is a connection between different parts of the Bible, such as verses, people, phrases, or locations. So, there are these verses like the Job, but we also talked about last week how there are sometimes locations can serve as these connection points. We talked about how in the hill country of Ephraim at the end of Judges is connected very much to the beginning scenes of 1 Samuel. And we're supposed to sort of kind of sense a foreboding to a certain degree. So the biblical authors are pointing to the fact that God is working at the awfulness that happened in the hill country of Ephraim. And they're saying, maybe out of this horrible place where these horrible things happened in the book of Judges, like maybe God can do something amazing with that. So that location of the hill country of Ephraim, that I wanted to point out that's another point in which the Bible is connected. So as you can see, I've shown this to you before. This is a visual representation of all of these cross-references. This shows you how often the biblical authors are making connections to other points in the Bible. The people that wrote the book, obviously it's God-inspired, but they know the Bible extremely well, and they want you to actually make those connections too. So it's like and there's more than just that. They're engaging not just with the biblical texts. Sometimes they're engaging with other texts from other cultures. So when we as modern Christians look at the Bible, it seems backwards to a certain degree. It seems like, how dare you say this about women? How dare you say this about that? But what we need to understand about the Bible is it's actually extremely revolutionary, and we wouldn't be where we are right now if it weren't for the Bible. So when you take certain laws, they seem archaic, but compared to say the Code of Hammurabi or whatever, which the Bible is in conversation with in some ways, it's sort of repudiating that. It is basically sort of flipping the injustice or the backwardness of the Code of Hammurabi or some other ancient code, and it's basically saying no, there is a different way. So here we go. Here's what we've done so far. We are going to be talking about here the exile, the post-exile, and we're going to talk a little bit about this intertestamental period, or the 400 years of silence, just a little bit, because here is the context that leads up to Jesus. That's where certain, where do the Pharisees come from? Where do the Sadducees, or the Essenes, or the Zealots? Where do all those people come from? Because we're not learning about them necessarily right here. So we are going to be talking about exile, post-exile, and then the intertestamental period. So before we go on, for the people that haven't been here, and also for us just to remind ourselves, I'm going to give you the quick arc real quickly before we get on to this exile, post-exile, and the intertestamental period. So very quickly, God creates the world, humanity sins, they fall, chaos ensues, and this is just Genesis. And then God, in the second half of Genesis, chooses one family, the family of Abraham, and eventually his grandson, Jacob, also known as Israel, to save the world. Unfortunately, those people, they wander through the promised land, but because of a famine, they end up in Egypt, where eventually they get enslaved, and then Moses saves them, or God saves them through Moses. They go into, and they think that's great, we're going to be saved, but unfortunately what ends up happening, instead of going directly to the promised land, they wander through the desert for 40 years, in part because they're not actually following the laws that are written, that God intends for them to follow. So Leviticus is sort of where these laws are talked about, and we discover in Numbers, because of the Israelites' hard-heartedness, they don't follow the laws and they wander for 40 years. Eventually they get to the edge of the promised land, and that first generation that escaped Egypt is no longer, it can't get through because of their hard-heartedness, and their children are now getting a speech at the edge of the promised land by Moses to say, like, listen, you should choose life, choose to follow the Torah, choose to follow the way that God has designed the world, or if you don't, if you choose death, you're essentially going to inherit a curse. This is what they're getting at when they're getting entering into the promised land. So they enter into the promised land, and Joshua, this is that bloody book where God informs them that they actually have to take out the Canaanites, because the Canaanites are essentially, their sin is so great, their sexual perversion as well as their willingness to sacrifice their children to appease who they believe are gods is so bad that God instructs them that they have to kill them. And it makes us generally uncomfortable, but unfortunately, in some ways, the the consequence of sin is death. But what we see here in Judges is that they didn't kill them all, and eventually, instead of infecting the Canaanites, or also starting it the promised land the way that it should be, the Israelites become worse, or become like the Canaanites. In fact, they might actually become worse. But as we can see here in the book of Ruth, which is a crazy story, it is one of these Canaanites, it's actually a Moabite, that God uses to sort of highlight how God will sort of take the mess of our lives, or the mess that the Israelites are making, and that non-Israelite, that Moabite woman, is the vessel which God chooses to bring about her salvation. It is through Ruth's line that eventually we get King David. And it's also through Ruth's line that we eventually get Jesus. So then, this is where we were last week. We were in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd King. We see the Israelites wanted to be like the other nations because they had a king. They thought that the king would save their problem. But what we discover is the king is perhaps maybe a little bit it's not what they wanted it to be. Saul is obviously a complete failure, and then we get David, and then David seems to be somewhat closer to that sort of person that's going to save them, that's going to bring them to the right relationship with God. But yeah, it doesn't end up happening. Obviously, David sends his children. In some ways, Solomon seems like he's on the right path. He asks for wisdom. In fact, that was a very great moment for him when he, instead of asking for power and wealth from God, he asked for God's wisdom. But that was his high watermark, because after that, essentially the kingdom falls apart. His sons, and one of his sons inherits, but then there was this coup that happens, and that this united kingdom of Israel that once was under Saul, David, and then Solomon now splits into two, and then you get northern Israel, and then you get Judah in the south. And then what happens in Kings is we actually see that the northern Israel is not following God's Torah. They have 20 kings roughly, and no king is good in northern Israel. And then you have in southern Judah, you actually have, I believe, out of 20 kings, they have 7 or 8, I don't remember exactly, 7 or 8 decent or okay ones, people that want to follow the Torah, people that are trying to take down the idol worships in the temple, and then people that are just trying to follow God's way. So there's 8 good kings out of 20. So it's sort of a mixed bag here. But unfortunately, even Judah, their sin is so bad, they are so on the wrong path, that God lets the Babylonians come and take over Jerusalem and then many of those people that are living in Jerusalem get carted off into exile and end up in Babylon. So in some ways this ends like one of the, this was always a confusing thing. Like when you get to Chronicles, this actually sort of retells the entire story with some stuff added, and it focuses more on the line of David and Judah and the tribe of Judah. But there is there's no right here, there's no books particularly about the exile, what happens in the exile. So you actually have to sort of go to other books. They talk about the exile in Daniel, they talk about the exile in Ezekiel, and Jeremiah and Isaiah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But when you get to that, so the exile books are kind of over here. There's some Esther sort of post-exile, and then this is when they return to the kingdom. So I never understood that. This is where they talk about the exile over here, and then this is where we are right now. So there's the context leading up to that, and we're going to skip that real quick. So in the prophetic books is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about these prophetic books. So here you have the major prophets, and then here you have the minor prophets. And these aren't necessarily in chronological order. They kind of are and they kind of aren't. And I'm just going to... So you have the major prophets right there. You have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then you have the minor prophets there. They're called the major prophets in large part because of the book sizes. The major prophets are the big books, whereas the minor prophets are the tiny books. And I want to say that is the only distinction there. So they're arranged roughly in chronological order, in their groupings. So this is chronological order here, chronological order here. And most of these books are written during the kingdom period. They're either going to be written during the kingdom period or the exilic period or the post-exilic period. Pastor did an amazing job of giving us the context of the book of Malachi, and this was the last book of the Bible before sort of the 400 years of silence. And so that was always something that was always confusing to me when I was cracking open a prophetic book, and these prophets are railing against the Israelites, and I'm just I have no idea what they're exactly mad about. What the prophets are mad about in general, very quickly, is generally that they're not following the Torah, and they're saying because you're not following the Torah, that curse that is talked about in Deuteronomy is going to befall them. So that's what's sort of going to happen. So here, the prophetic books. The prophetic books in the Bible are typically divided into two groups: the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and the minor prophets, the remaining 12 books, including Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. With the major prophets appearing first, followed by the minor prophets, generally arranged in a roughly chronological order within each group. So prophets are not fortune tellers. They're not just there to predict the future. They do sometimes predict the future, and that actually shows if they are true prophets or not, whether or not what they say is going to come true. But they're not just predicting the future. And this was another confusion that I had, was that I always thought that the prophets were just kind of either just talking about Jesus, or, I didn't even fully know what the prophets were talking about. I just knew that they were talking about future events, and sometimes those future events were about Jesus. But prophets are also, what they're doing is they're speaking on behalf of God. They are sort of like these weather vanes, where they sense God's spirit, and maybe also talk directly with God, and they actually communicate hey, you're not following the Torah. You're not following God's law. You're not following the way that things should be. In fact, you're choosing death. The things that you're choosing, not taking care of the poor, and sometimes not taking care of the immigrant, sometimes being sexually promiscuous, or just not putting things in the right order. Since you're doing that, God's judgment is going to happen on you. And some of them predict predict what's going to happen because of that. And sometimes prophetic books will often contain apocalyptic visions. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the book of Daniel here, because part of the book of Daniel is talking about the exile. We know in Daniel, we know about Nebuchadnezzar in the fiery furnace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we know about Daniel in the lion's den and all that stuff. But like the second half of the book of the Bible is full of strange visions and strange combinations of animals and people rising out of the sea and this Son of Man character. And there's just a lot of confusing imagery. And what apocalyptic visions are is, what's an apocalypse? Does anyone know? Destruction? Yeah, it's like we often think about the apocalypse being like the end times, right? God is bringing about the end of the world. When you watch an apocalyptic movie, often you're seeing the world come to an end. And that is part of what the word means. But apocalypse is also, it's a revealing. It's a revealing about God's true plan. So when you see apocalyptic visions, it's not just about the end of the world. It's about God revealing what's happening behind the scenes. So that is often what's happening in these apocalyptic visions. And so, it could be, and we're not going to talk about it too much, but when you get into the Bible and you get to these weird visions or weird dreams, sometimes those animals that appear, they could be real beasts. They could be. I couldn't tell you. They could be real demons. But they're also these symbolic representations. It's like when Joseph was interpreting the dreams for Pharaoh in Genesis. Those sort of exact visions are happening in books like in books like Daniel, as well as some other prophets. But I'm going to just read you this definition. In the Bible, an apocalyptic vision refers to a prophetic dream or revelation where a person glimpses a hidden reality about the future, often involving dramatic imagery of cosmic events, the battle between good and evil, and the ultimate triumph of God, essentially unveiling, which is that apocalypse, or revealing truths about the world that are not readily apparent in everyday life. The book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the entire Bible, are some of the most prominent examples of apocalyptic literature in the Bible. So, in some ways, the book of Revelation is in conversation with the book of Daniel. So in order to understand those weird things that are talked about in Revelation, we need to know what's going on with Daniel, or at least to get the full picture. So that's that. So we're going to talk about the book of Isaiah today, sort of to show you at the very end of the kingdom period where Isaiah is speaking to the kings of, I think, just Judah, about how they're going wrong and what's going to happen because of that. So we're hopefully going to be watching 4 videos today. That's probably not going to happen because I just talked a long time. But let's go. Oh, wow, what's happening there? I swear that I was not going to have another technical difficulty. I know, this will be...
In the first video, we explored chapters 1 to 39, which was Isaiah's message of judgment and hope for Jerusalem. He accused Israel's leaders of rebellion against God, instead through Syria and then Babylon. Israel's kingdom would come crashing down and enacted God's judgment. And so chapter 39 concluded with Isaiah predicting 100 years after.
coming. This is quite hilarious.
After Isaiah, it all sadly. But Isaiah's greater hope was for a new, purified Jerusalem. The book of the prophet Isaiah. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 to 39, which was Isaiah's message of judgment and hope over Jerusalem. He accused Israel's leaders of rebellion against God and sin. Book of the prophet Isaiah. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 to 9, which was Isaiah's message of judgment and hope for Jerusalem. He accused Israel's leaders of rebellion against God. He said that through Assyria and then Babylon, Israel's kingdom would crash down and impact God's judgment. And so chapter 39 concluded with Isaiah predicting Jerusalem's fall to Babylon in exile. And 100 years after Isaiah, it all sadly. But Isaiah's greater hope was for a new, purified Jerusalem, where God's kingdom would be restored through the true Messiah. The book of the prophet Isaiah, in all nations would come. Video we explored chapters 1 to chapters 40, but Isaiah's message of judgment is amazing.
It's hilarious, isn't it? If you've been with me, last week was the only time that apparently this worked. Oh my God.
As I hook my computer up, just a funny story. So last night, maybe you can do it. Last night in the Timberwolves game, somebody wrecked the net. It took them 45 minutes, 4 different maintenance people to come down to actually put the net back on. So technical difficulties happen everywhere. All right? And the live stream on Wednesday, yes. You just gotta hit play in the middle. It'll give it to you once you.
The book of the prophet Isaiah.
There we go.
Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the latter half of Israel's kingdom, and he spoke on God's behalf to the leaders of Jerusalem and Judah. He spoke, first of all, a message of God's judgment. He warned Israel's corrupt leaders that their rebellion against their covenant with God would come at a cost. That God was going to use the great empires of Assyria and after them Babylon to judge Jerusalem if they persisted in idolatry and oppression of the poor. But that announcement was combined with a message of hope. Isaiah believed deeply that God would one day fulfill all of his covenant promises, that he would send a king from David's line to establish God's kingdom, remember 2 Samuel 7, that he would lead Israel in obedience to all of the laws of the covenant made at Mount Sinai, remember Exodus chapter 19. And all of this was so that God's blessing and salvation would flow outward to all of the nations, like God promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And it's this hope that compelled Isaiah to speak out against the corruption and idolatry of Israel in his day. Now, the book has a pretty complex literary design, but there's one simple way to see how it all fits together. Chapters 1 through 39 contain 3 large sections that develop Isaiah's warning of judgment on Israel. And it all culminates in an event pointed to at the end of chapter 39, the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the people to Babylon. But in chapters 1 to 39, there's also a message of hope that after the exile, God's covenant promises would all be fulfilled. And chapters 40 to 66 pick up that promise of hope and develops it further. In this video, we're just going to focus on chapters 1 to 39. The first main section focuses on Isaiah's vision of judgment and hope for Jerusalem. And it begins as Isaiah accuses the city's leaders of covenant rebellion, idolatry, injustice. And God says he's going to judge the city by sending the nations to conquer Israel. Isaiah says that this will be like a purifying fire that burns away all that's worthless in Israel in order to create a new Jerusalem that's populated by a remnant that has repented and turned back to God. And Isaiah says that that's when God's kingdom will come and all nations will come to the temple in Jerusalem and learn of God's justice, bringing about an age of universal peace and harmony. Now, it's this basic storyline of the old Jerusalem purifying judgment into the new Jerusalem. This is going to get repeated over and over throughout the book, getting filled in with increasing detail. So, at the center of this section is Isaiah's grand vision of God sitting on his throne in the temple. And he's surrounded by these heavenly creatures that are shouting that God is holy, holy, holy. And Isaiah suddenly realizes just how corrupt he and his people Israel are. And he's certain that he's going to be destroyed by God's holiness, but he's not. God's holiness, in the form of this burning coal, comes and burns him, but not to destroy. Rather, it purifies him from his sin. And as Isaiah ponders the strange experience, God commissions him with a very difficult task. He is to keep announcing this coming judgment. But because Israel has reached a point of no return, his warnings are going to have a paradoxical effect of hardening the people. But Isaiah is to trust God's plan. Israel is going to be chopped down like a tree and left like a stump in a field. And that stump will itself be scorched and burned. But after all of that burning, God says that this smoldering stump is a holy seed that will survive into the future. It's a small sign of hope, but who or what is that holy seed? The rest of this section offers an answer. Isaiah confronts Ahaz, a descendant of David and a king of Jerusalem, and he announces his downfall. God says that it's the great empire of Assyria who will first chop Israel down and devastate the land, but there's hope. Because of God's promise to David, he's going to send after this destruction a new king named Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Emmanuel's kingdom is going to set God's people free from violent, oppressive empires. And Isaiah describes this coming king as a small shoot of new growth that will emerge from the old stump of David's family. It's this king that's the holy seed from chapter 6. And the king is going to be empowered by God's Spirit to rule over a new Jerusalem and bring justice for the poor, and all nations will look to this messianic king for guidance. His kingdom will transform all creation, bringing peace. Now, you finish chapters 1 through 12 with a pretty good understanding of Isaiah's message of judgment and hope. But when will this all happen? Isaiah saw another empire arising after Assyria, and that's Babylon, who would also attack Jerusalem and actually succeed in destroying it. And that brings us into the next sections of the book. So first, we have a large collection of poems that explore God's judgment and hope for the nations. We learn, first of all, of the fall of Babylon and Israel's neighbors. Isaiah could see Assyria's world power would one day be replaced by the empire of Babylon, a nation even more destructive and arrogant. Babylon's kings claimed that they were higher than all other gods, and so God vows to bring Babylon down. And not only Babylon. Isaiah goes on to list Israel's neighbors, accusing them all of the same kind of pride and injustice, and he predicts their ultimate ruin. But remember, for Isaiah, God's judgment is never the final word for Israel or the nations. And that leads into the next section with a series of poems that tell a tale of two cities. There's the lofty city that has exalted itself above God and become corrupt and unjust. This city is an archetype of rebellious humanity and is described with language that's all borrowed from Isaiah's earlier descriptions of Jerusalem and Assyria and Babylon all put together. This city is destined for ruin, and one day is going to be replaced by the new Jerusalem, where God reigns as king over a redeemed humanity from all nations, and there's no more death or suffering. These chapters are the climax to this section, and it shows how Isaiah's message pointed far beyond his own day. It was a message for all who are waiting for God to bring his justice on violent, oppressive kingdoms and bring his kingdom of justice and peace and healing love. The following section returns the focus to the rise and fall of Jerusalem. And first we find a whole bunch of poems where Isaiah accuses Jerusalem's leaders for turning to Egypt for military protection against Assyria. He knows this will backfire. And Isaiah says that only trust in their God and repentance can save Israel now. Which gets illustrated by the following story about the rise of Hezekiah, king of Jerusalem. just as Isaiah predicted, the Assyrian armies come and try to attack the city. And so Hezekiah humbles himself before God, and he prays for divine deliverance, and the city is miraculously saved overnight. But Hezekiah's rise is immediately followed by his fall. So he hosts a delegation from Babylon, and he tries to impress them by showing everything in Jerusalem's treasury and temple and palaces. It's clearly an effort to make another political alliance for protection. Isaiah hears about this and he confronts Hezekiah for his foolishness. He predicts that this ally will one day betray him and return as an enemy to conquer Jerusalem. And we know from 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 that Isaiah was right. Over 100 years later, Babylon would turn on Jerusalem, come and destroy the city, its temple, and carry the Israelites away to exile in Babylon. And so all of Isaiah's warnings of divine judgment in chapters 1 to 39 lead up to this moment. He's shown to be a true prophet because it all came to pass like he said. But remember, the purpose of God's judgment was to purify Jerusalem and bring the holy seed and messianic kingdom over all nations. And it's that hope that gets explored in the next part of the book. But for now, that's what Isaiah chapters 1 to 39 are all about.
Okay. Just in case. All right. Well, hopefully I have the technical issues resolved. As I said, I've made pronouncements against technology
Accusations with the following arguments. He said first that the exile to Babylon was not divine. It was divinely orchestrated as a judgment for Israel's sinners. And second, it was for Israel's sake that God raised up.
Take that. I've made pronouncements against technology. I don't know if anyone know what the word Luddite means. I have said that I'm a Luddite, which means that I hate technology, and apparently technology hates me back. So that was lovely. There we go. Does anyone have any initial responses? Not much time with what I want to cover, but anyone want to say anything? Yes?
Well, I see us today going through the same exact thing.
Absolutely, yes. It is one of those things where exile and that is the human condition. And on top of that, we're in a culture that is also corrupt and sinful, and it's hard not to draw those comparisons. And because of that, and just for sake of time, I want to get to the next video. The next video is much more of we're not talking about the Bible per se, we're talking about the connections in the Bible. So we're not going to be talking about the exile and what's happening quite yet. We're going to be talking about what it feels like to be in exile, because that exile is a very important theme that's throughout the entire book of the Bible. And before we get to the second half of Isaiah, I wanted to talk about what it feels like what it feels like to be in exile, and how we can look at other biblical stories to see that theme of exile is there right in front of us. Hopefully this works.
There's something about being home, where everything's just right. We're surrounded by people we love and trust. There's a feeling of stability and safety.
And while some people get to experience this kind of home, many do not. Others might even be forced to leave their home and go live in a foreign land. We call this going into exile.
Yeah, in exile, everything is disorienting. You're in the unknown.
And in the story of the Bible, this is where the ancient Israelites found themselves, conquered by Babylon, living in exile, far from their homeland.
And so they had asked themselves, how did we end up here? And is there any hope of going home?
And the whole story of the Bible is designed to address those very questions.
The whole story? Really?
Yeah, go back to the first pages of the Bible. Where does humanity live?
Okay, they live in this really sweet garden, their home.
And they're there on one condition, that they trust and follow God's one command, and they don't. And so the consequence is banishment from the garden.
Ah, they're sent into exile.
Exactly. And so this story has been designed to set you up for Israel's story. How they were given the gift of the promised land and were able to stay there on one condition, that they be faithful to the terms of their covenant relationship with God.
They didn't, and they were sent into exile.
And if you still don't see the parallel between exile from the garden and exile from Israel, think about this. In Genesis, humanity's exile led up to the story about the building of what city?
Oh yeah, Babylon. The same place the Israelites are sent.
But that's not the end of either story. In the first Babylon, God called Abraham to leave and travel to the Promised Land. And that story was designed to give hope to the Israelites currently living in the later Babylon.
Now eventually, they do get to leave and travel back to their promised homeland.
And when they did, it wasn't home sweet home. Oppressive empires were still ruling over them, and the people kept acting in the same corrupt ways as their ancestors. And so the biblical prophets said that exile wasn't actually over.
How could they think they were still in exile when they're at home?
Yeah, this is really important. In the Hebrew scriptures, Israel's Babylonian exile became an image of something more universal. It's that feeling of alienation and longing for something more, no matter where you live.
Yeah, I can relate to this. I have a great home, but it's situated in a world scarred with pain and broken relationships, death, tragedy, done by others, but also done by me.
And so in the Bible, exile is the human condition. We all keep repeating this pattern of human corruption leading to a Babylon that we can't escape. And it doesn't matter where you live, we are all longing for a better home.
Now, Israel's scriptures held out hope that one day God would send a king who would rescue the world from all of the Babylons he created.
And after many generations pass, we meet this Israelite named Jesus of Nazareth. He wandered about with no home, announcing the great restoration, that reality of home that Israel and all humanity has been looking for.
Yeah, Jesus really cared about people who didn't have homes. He welcomed in the stranger. He said God's love is shown when you invite in the outcast and throw parties for people who don't have a place to belong.
Jesus also claimed that Israel and all humanity had lost its way, that our self-centeredness drives us to create false homes based on status and power, and these inevitably exclude others. We live in an exile of our own making. But Jesus said the true way home is one of weakness, of service, and of forgiveness. And then Jesus went into exile alongside us to show us the true way home.
Which is?
Well, Jesus said he is the way. His life and self-giving love proved more powerful than humanity's failure. He opened up a pathway to our real home. And as Jesus' followers committed themselves to him, they discovered this new way of being human. They believed that the real return from exile had begun. And so they would call themselves sojourners or wanderers.
Oh, right. They would say things like, the world isn't our home, and we're citizens of heaven.
And so Jesus' followers remain exiles as they wait for that day when Jesus returns to transform this world into a true home.
Okay. Okay, as you can see, that was, as I said, much more of a atmospheric, showing you that there are connections between the exile that we're talking about in history right now of the Jews being exiled from their home in Jerusalem and then going into Babylon. But then also you can see that the biblical authors are often talking about exile when even talking about like the Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden. Does anyone have any questions or responses to that video?
I think that's a really, when I think of the word exile, I automatically think of the big picture of a lot of people. I don't think about myself
Yeah.
being exiled.
Yeah, I mean, granted, I don't. It's the Bible Project's not like gospel truth per se, but like it is them saying that the exile is like the human condition. Like it's like I think all of us can experience that feeling of like no matter where you are, there's a sense that things aren't right. Things aren't the way that they're supposed to be, no matter how good it actually is. And that sort of theme of the Israelites, essentially once they leave Babylon and they go back home to Jerusalem and they're able to rebuild that temple, that feeling is very poignant of like, this is not like, yes, we are in Jerusalem, we're in the promised land, we're rebuilding the temple, we're rebuilding Jerusalem, but something's still not right. And that's definitely, that will be picked up later. So does anyone have any other thoughts? Yes?
I think of the prodigal son.
Yeah.
Into almost a self-fulfilled exile.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. That's a great example of like a father who loves his son. Obviously, the Father, God loves us. And sometimes the Son, we choose things that God knows ultimately that's bad for us, right? And he lets it happen anyway. He gives the Son the inheritance. And he says, all right, go on. And the Son squanders it. And then he has to go back and he offers to be, the Father's servant. But yeah, that's another example of exile. Thank you for making that connection. So just moving quickly, I want to talk about just a couple of books of the Bible in brief before we get to the next video. We're not going to be showing those sort of particular videos, but I just want to let you know what these books of the Bible are about in general. The book of Daniel tells the story of a Jewish youth, Daniel, who was taken captive to Babylon and rose to a position of high influence in the king's court due to his exceptional wisdom and ability to interpret dreams, all while remaining faithful to God despite facing persecution. Daniel's key narratives included his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, defying the king's idol worship, and Daniel himself being thrown into a den of lions for refusing to stop praying to his God. The book is notable for its prophetic visions, including detailed depictions of future empires and the coming of a Son of Man figure, offering hope to the exiled Israelites. So that's just the book of Daniel in brief. I guess I definitely want to point out that Son of Man figure. This Son of Man figure, that's basically the second half of Daniel. And that's sort of is the Son of Man figure, that messianic figure, this human that's essentially going to sit at the right hand of the Father. That's what Jesus himself is dialoguing with the book of Daniel. So everyone around Jesus is calling him the Messiah, but Jesus really rarely calls himself the Messiah. He actually only almost exclusively calls himself the Son of Man. And we can't go too far into that, but there's some really amazing connections there. I mean, I would love to give a class on just the Son of Man because it's that interesting. So Jesus is dialoguing with the book of Daniel when he's saying Son of Man. So here's another book that happens during the exile. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, was a Hebrew prophet who delivered God's message to Judah, primarily warning them of impending destruction due to their idol worship and disobedience against God's covenant. He prophesied that Jerusalem would be conquered by Babylon and its people exiled, a message that was met with resistance and persecution. Despite the harsh reality of his prophecies, Jeremiah also spoke of hope for restoration and a new covenant with God. His book in the Bible details the struggle as a prophet, including personal anguish and the difficult task of delivering God's judgment to his people. Although his messages were often grim, Jeremiah's enduring legacy is his unwavering commitment to speaking truth to power, even in the face of adversity. So I'm going to show you another book. It's also, or another video also about exile here. But this is sort of addressing okay, now that we all admit that to a certain degree we are all in exile, just like the Jews were, how do we live in God's kingdom, or in a world that's not God's kingdom? How do we do that and still honor God? So that's the next video that I want to show you.
In the year 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And a year later, the city and the temple were plundered and burned.
Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon. They became exiles.
And so now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods.
Now some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these new gods as their own.
And you might think those are your only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. To settle in, build houses, plant gardens, grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
So this is like a third way.
Yeah, it's not compromise or revolt.
What does it look like?
Well, there's a whole book of the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel.
Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile.
And because Daniel had a royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some friends to work in the high court of Babylon.
Work for the enemy, that would be compromise. Or they could gain the king's trust, take him down from the inside.
That's what you might expect. But instead, they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style.
So they seek Babylon's well-being. But in doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage?
It could seem that way, but actually, they aren't. As you read on, the story focuses on moments where they draw the line, and they choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon.
So, for example,
Well, like when they're commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he's a god.
they won't go that far.
Right, this is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice, but they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. And so God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness.
So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God.
Yeah, this is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion.
So they're still exiles, but don't Daniel and his friends long to go home?
Yes, in fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace.
When did he think this ruler would come?
Well, at first he thought within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another.
And so Babylon did fall, and Israel did get to go back home, but now they're ruled by Babylon's successors.
And so they maintained the mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. And they continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. And this leads us to the time of Jesus.
The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Now, some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods.
But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, don't mistake Caesar for God. God's the one who deserves your total life and allegiance.
So the way of Jesus is this same mix of loyalty and subversion.
Yeah, like he taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations.
The king that Daniel had hoped for.
Right. And Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail.
And so until then, his followers are living in a type of exile.
Yeah, this is why the Apostle Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place you happen to live, to honor and love all people, but then he reminds them that this isn't their true home. They're still living in Babylon.
But, well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore.
Or it doesn't. In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil.
Okay, so we all live and work in Babylon. How do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater?
Yes, Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That's the way of the exile.
We are really battling time here. So I hopefully you liked that video, but I want to. So they were in exile for a while, but as you heard, that like they did eventually go back home, but they were still under like other rulers authority. So right here in the book of Ezra, you actually see this is where the Judeans get to go home to Jerusalem. And I'm going to just read the very first book of Ezra. During the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in fulfillment of the message from the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, the Lord prompted Cyrus, king of Persia, to make this proclamation throughout his entire kingdom, which was also released in written form, an official statement from Cyrus, king of Persia. All of the kingdoms of the earth have been given to me by the Lord God of heaven, and he specifically charged me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Therefore, who among the Lord's people trusts in his God? Whoever among this group wishes to do so may travel to Jerusalem of Judah and build the temple of the Lord God of Israel, the God of Jerusalem. Furthermore, everyone who wishes to repatriate from any territory where he now resides is to receive assistance from his fellow residents in the form of silver, gold, equipment, and pack animals, in addition to voluntary offerings for the temple of the God of Jerusalem. In response, the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, remember the two remaining tribes, the priests and descendants of Levi, and all those who have been prompted by God, prepare to travel to rebuild the temple of the Lord, which was in Jerusalem. So all of their neighbors equipped the travelers with silver, gold, equipment, pack animals, and valuable goods, in addition to the voluntary things. So here you have a Persian king, Cyrus, who is not Jewish, who is not an Israelite, telling them to leave Babylon where they were and to go back to where they came from. Except this time it's kind of at the behest of the king of Persia. So obviously God in many ways did give the Jewish lands over to the king of Persia. This is him speaking here. This was in God's plan. But for right now, and it seems like in the future, from now on, there's not going to be like an independent Jewish or Israelite state anymore. It's going to be like underneath the thumb of a foreign authority. So yeah, so that's that. I mean, there's so much. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah actually go into in detail what it's like to rebuild the temple. Yes, Virginia.
Yeah, I was just going to put some context to this. Cyrus came after Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
And he saw, what did he see? He saw the man of the five rings. Then came Darius, and what did he see? He saw Daniel in the lion's den.
Yeah.
Then came Cyrus,
Yeah.
okay, the Persian. So the building of the knowledge that God was supreme came from these various incidents of people living in doing what the video said.
Sure.
Living. And so those were really dramatic examples of
Right.
experience of God's power there. But that's, you can see how Cyrus.
Yeah, I don't remember. Does the Bible actually? I mean, obviously,
That's the
the
order.
storyline is like, yeah, you have Darius the Mede.
But then the Persians came. So that's
Right.
that's the historical order. So when you think about the wise men, okay, that came to look for Jesus,
Yeah.
they had this all history as well.
Right.
In terms of these Jewish people living in that community.
Right. Well, I mean, the Jews during the temple period, or during the exilic period, in many ways became the Jews as we now know them. They're these very distinct group of people that are very comfortable in living in other people's culture while maintaining their own cultural heritage. I mean, like that, it is astounding to a certain degree that Jews still exist, because they're always this minority in a place of majority, and they somehow figure out how to exist there. But yeah, there's a lot of good stories in Daniel that talk about the different. You have Nebuchadnezzar, who was Babylonian, and then you had Darius, who was a Mede, which I think is somewhat related to the Persians, but I can't tell you specifically about that. But the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah talks about them going back into the promised land, and it's not what they thought it was going to be. They rebuild the second temple. It's the temple that Jesus himself would have, where you would find him. So this is the beginning of the second temple period. And yeah, so man, I don't know if I really can't do the second half of the book of Isaiah, and I was hoping I was going to. I mean, we could. I don't know if we have the blessing of pastor, or like because I feel like this is sort of like the Christmas bring it home, but it's an 8-minute video. Anyone with authority? Better to ask forgiveness. Yeah, feel free for you to leave, but you can watch.
Look at the prophet Isaiah. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 to 39, which was Isaiah's message of judgment and hope for Jerusalem. He accused Israel's leaders of rebellion against God and said that through Assyria and then Babylon, Israel's kingdom would come crashing down in an act of God's judgment. And so chapter 39 concluded with Isaiah predicting Jerusalem's fall to Babylon and the exile. And 100 years after Isaiah, it all sadly came to pass. But Isaiah's greater hope was for a new, purified Jerusalem, where God's kingdom would be restored through the future Messianic king. And all nations would come together in peace. And so chapters 40 and following explore this great hope. The first main section, chapters 40 to 48, open with an announcement of hope and comfort for Israel. The people are told that the Babylonian exile is over and that Israel's sin has been dealt with and a new era is beginning. So they should all return home to Jerusalem, where God himself will bring his kingdom and all nations will see his glory. Now, let's stop for a moment, because this opening announcement raises a big question. That is, who is saying all of this? Whose voice are we hearing in these words of hope? The perspective of the prophet in these chapters is that of somebody who's living after the exile, in other words, in the time period described by Ezra and Nehemiah. But Isaiah died 150 years before any of that. So what are we supposed to make of this? Well, there are many who think that it's still Isaiah in his own day speaking, but that he's been prophetically transported, so to speak, 200 years into the future, and that he's speaking to future generations as if the exile was past. However, the book of Isaiah itself gives us some clues that something else is probably going on. In chapters 8 and 29 and 30, we're told that after Isaiah was rejected by Israel's leaders, that he wrote and sealed up in a scroll all of his messages of judgment and hope, and that he passed it on to his disciples as a witness for days to come. Eventually, Isaiah died, waiting for God to vindicate his words. Now remember, chapters 1 to 39 were designed to show us that Isaiah's predictions of judgment were fulfilled in the exile. He's a true prophet. And so after exile is over, Isaiah's disciples, who have treasured his words for so long, open up the scroll and begin applying his words of hope to their own day. So on this view, the book of Isaiah consists of that first collection of Isaiah's words, as well as the writings of his prophetic disciples, that God uses to extend Isaiah's message of hope to future generations. Whichever view you end up taking, everybody agrees that these chapters are announcing that the future hope has come, that God is fulfilling Isaiah's prophetic promises. And so the prophet hopes that Israel will respond by becoming God's servant. That is, after experiencing God's justice and mercy through history, that they will now begin to share with the nations who God truly is. But that's not what's happening. Israel, instead of bearing witness to the nations, is actually complaining and even accusing God. They say, the Lord doesn't pay attention to our trouble. In fact, he's ignoring our cause. The Babylonian exile, understandably, caused Israel to lose faith in their God. I mean, maybe he's not that powerful. Maybe the gods of Babylon are way greater than our God. And so the rest of these chapters, 41 to 47, are set up like a trial scene. God is responding to these doubts and accusations with the following arguments. He says first that the exile to Babylon was not divine neglect. Rather, it was divinely orchestrated as a judgment for Israel's sin. And second, it was for Israel's sake that God raised up Persia to conquer Babylon so they could come back home, fulfilling Isaiah's words. So the right conclusion that Israel should draw is that their God is the king of history, not the idols of the nations. In the fall of Babylon and the rise of the Persian king Cyrus, Israel should see God's hand at work, and so become his servant, telling the nations who he is. But by the end of the trial, chapter 48, we find that Israel is still as rebellious and hard-hearted as their ancestors. And so God disqualifies them as his servant, but God still is on a mission to bless the nations. And so the prophet says God's going to do a new thing to solve this problem, which moves into the next section, 49 to 55. We're introduced to a figure who's called God's servant, who's going to fulfill God's mission and do what Israel has failed to do. God gives this servant the title Israel and sends this person on a mission to, first of all, restore the people of Israel back to their God, but second, to become God's light to the nations. And we're told that this servant is empowered by God's Spirit to announce good news and to bring God's kingdom over all of the nations. It sounds just like the Messianic king from chapters 9 and 11. But then we learn the surprising way of how the servant will bring God's kingdom. He's going to be rejected and beaten and ultimately killed by his own people. In reality, as he's being accused and sentenced to death, he's dying on behalf of the sin of his own people. The prophet says the servant's death is a sacrifice of atonement for the people's evil and rebellion. And then, after his death, all of a sudden, the servant is just alive again. And we hear that by his death, he provided a way to make people righteous. That is, to put them in a right relationship with God. And so this section concludes by describing two ways people can respond to the servant. Some will respond with humility and turn from their sins and accept what God's servant did on their behalf. These people are called the servants and also the seed. Remember the holy seed from chapter 6. These are the ones who will experience the blessing of the Messianic kingdom. But there are others who are called simply the wicked, and they reject both the servant and his servants, which brings us to the final section of the book, 56 to 66, where the servants inherit God's kingdom. These chapters are beautifully designed as a symmetry that brings together all of the themes of the book. At the very center are three beautiful poems that describe how the Spirit-empowered servant is announcing the good news of God's kingdom to the poor. And he reaffirms all of the promises of hope from earlier in the book. The New Jerusalem, inhabited by God's servants, will be the place from which God's justice and mercy and blessing flow out to all the nations of the world. And surrounding these poems are two long prayers of repentance, where the servants confess Israel's sin, and they grieve over all of the evil they see in the world around them. And so they ask God to forgive them, and that his kingdom would come here on earth as it is in heaven. Now, on each side of these prayers are collections of more poems that contrast the destiny of the servants with that of the wicked who persecute them. God says he's going to bring his justice on all who pollute his good world with their evil and selfishness and idolatry, and that he's going to remove them from his city forever. But the servants, those who are humble before God and who repent and own their evil, they are forgiven, and they will inherit the New Jerusalem, which, we discovered, is an image for an entirely renewed creation, where death and suffering are gone forever. And this brings us to the very outer frame of this part of the book. In this renewed world of God's kingdom, people from all nations are invited to come and join the servants of God's covenant family so that everyone could know their Creator and Redeemer. And so the book of Isaiah ends with the very grand vision of the fulfillment of all of God's covenant promises. Through the suffering servant king, God creates a covenant family of all nations who are awaiting the hope of God's justice in bringing a renewed creation, where God's kingdom finally comes here on earth as it is in heaven. And that's the very powerful hope of the book of Isaiah.
Yeah, obviously we're well past our time here, but yeah, I thought it was a nice way to conclude. Merry Christmas to everyone. I hope you enjoyed going through the Bible in quick succession like that. So let me pray first real quick, and then we can get going. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that you reveal yourself in the Bible. I pray that you would help us to study the Bible more and more every day, that we would meditate on it, that we would chew on its contents, and that we would realize that your good book is deathless. We thank you for your Son, and we thank you for Isaiah. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.